And welcome back to another episode of Casey Campbell's Videocast. And we are proud to welcome Bob Pockrass from Fox Sports, who covers NASCAR, one of the best out there. Bob, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on, Casey. Hope you're doing well.
Yep, hope you are too, Bob. Also, obviously the weirdest thing out there, let's start at the beginning. When you were in Atlanta, did you have any idea that the race could be canceled, and when did you start really hearing about it?
Well, I think so. Flew to Atlanta on the Thursday of that week, and a lot of other sports were starting to cancel, or they were pretty much considering canceling or had canceled. So I don't think it was too much of a surprise when NASCAR did. There's some thought, there is still some thought that an automobile race can be done a little bit more safer for the participants, that they can be more spread out, that the drivers are obviously in their uniforms and have helmets on and aren't, there's no, they're separated by each other by the cars, and that so that maybe there is a less of a, or maybe more of a potential to be able to put in social distancing standards and have an event. And it looks like, that's still the feeling, as you can tell by NASCAR hoping to get back sometime in May.
Yeah, I've looked on Twitter of these potential dates where it could be. I know the mid-May target is there, but first, before that even happens, they got to get the shops open. I know NASCAR's talked with Governor Cooper's office, Roy Cooper of North Carolina. Are those talks improving? Have you heard anything with that?
I don't know if they're improving. I think it'll be pretty much what they decide. The governor wants to. The executive order in North Carolina ends on April 29th. They say that they're going to have an announcement by the end of this week on, what they would need to either lift the order or to ease some of the restrictions on the order. And so I think what NASCAR is doing is they're trying to see, hey, even if this order is in place, what kinds of things potentially can be done so that some work can go on in the shops, because, there are states where they want to have races, and there's obviously North Carolina, there's still hope that the Coke 600 can go on Memorial Day weekend, most likely without fans.
Is NASCAR looking into mainly keeping it in the Southeast area? Because what it sounds like is that their teams aren't going to bring as many crew members down to help prevent the spread. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, Texas could be scheduled for first week in June, so that's not the Southeast. That they already have the IndyCar race scheduled for there, so the potential for a doubleheader there. But I would think initially the first few weeks would most likely be the Southeast, just a little bit easier for them to get cars and everybody there. But you're used to seeing 10 to 13 crew members per car, and now you might be seeing more like 5 to 10.
Ultimately, going forward, as reference goes down, does each race by NASCAR throughout the schedule, whether it's in South Carolina, whether it's in Tennessee, Michigan, New York, does that have to be approved by local leaders, health officials, and ultimately does the governor have to sign off on that?
Yeah, well, I think if there's a ban on assembly or anything like that, yeah. I would say that your NASCAR most likely is not going to do something if local government officials don't approve it. They rely on those officials too much for help, especially when there are fans, for traffic, right? They need local law enforcement. They need local law enforcement at the facility. So I just they're not just going to say, well, we're not going to listen to you. Now, I think what you could potentially happen is you could have like a city and a mayor, or a city and a county potentially at odds, but beyond, or a city and a governor maybe at odds. But I think for the most part, NASCAR is not going to do anything that would put in jeopardy relationships that they would need in the long term.
Have you heard anything about anything going on? And from me being from the Michigan area, anything regarding Michigan International Speedway with any of those races coming up in June? Because that would directly affect, I think, would be if Texas moved to that week, it would be that weekend, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the idea would be is that, Michigan would have a doubleheader in their weekend in August if that is, if they end up going somewhere else earlier or going somewhere else in June, either to make up a race or, if the teams do not want to travel that far, or just depending on how things go. It changes all the time. I mean, we're talking at the time we're talking, 2 or 3 days ago, it's totally different. Hey, let's try to get Homestead in. Maybe we can get Homestead in. And then it's like, well, we're not sure whether we can get everything. Do we want to fly down there? And do we really want to fly? And, hey, could we go to Darlington? Okay. So yeah, maybe Darlington because South Carolina's good. Well, what about Atlanta? There's just all these different scenarios, and it's pretty fluid and keeps changing.
Let's go on a completely different subject. NASCAR, of course, the biggest headline last week was Kyle Larson, who used a inappropriate racial slur during an I race, and was fired by Chip Ganassi Racing last week. What is the status on that? Is Ganassi somewhere close to naming a driver, and likely Ross Chastain could possibly get that ride? Is that
Well,
and what's that?
Ross Chastain has a relationship, obviously, with Ganassi. He won an Xfinity race with Ganassi, but he's also running for the Xfinity Championship with Kaulig. And I think, there's some feeling, well, he brought a sponsor to Kaulig, really helped Kaulig boost the two cars. Can you leave that after 4 or 5 races and go somewhere else? And then what happens to all that? So I think there's still some discussion. I don't think there's a sense of urgency yet on Ganassi's part because they've got a few weeks, right, until they start racing again. So, but while Ross Chastain seems to be certainly a candidate, I wouldn't guarantee that Ross will be in that ride. And then the question is who goes in? And I think what Chip Ganassi has to decide first is, do they want somebody who can run for the Cup title? And if that's the case, then do they go to NASCAR and say, hey, can we hire somebody who hasn't been in a car? And would they have a waiver? Or do we have to hire somebody who's been in a car? So, I think they're going through that process now, trying to decide what their priorities are, talking to their sponsors, and that they know they have a couple of weeks before they really have to make a final decision.
And what's Kyle Larson's next steps? Because did he register for sensitivity training? Have you heard?
Yeah, so he would have to attend sensitivity training, and I think he has at least started the process. Typically that takes anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, and then once he's done with that process, he gets to ask NASCAR for reinstatement. NASCAR in the past would typically just reinstate somebody because they typically missed a couple of races at least. Now, in this scenario, we won't know what NASCAR's decision will be until Kyle actually asks for reinstatement, because they're not going to say, well, he's going to be out for 2 weeks. That they'll wait and see when he applies for reinstatement and make that decision then.
What could fans possibly see if once NASCAR does get back? Is it no pit stops, 1-day shows, like no practice, no qualifying? What could a NASCAR race be like once the sport does decide to get back?
Well, it could be very different. I mean, you're talking potentially just lining up and racing. You could have a short practice and then race. But I think more would potentially prefer to just qualify and race, because if you qualify and race, you don't need to bring a backup car, because, I mean, are you going to wreck in your 1 lap qualifying? Probably not. And so there's no backup cars. So that means a lot less equipment. You just need a few people really to bring the car through tech. And then potentially, if you have a race where you have controlled pit stops or breaks, those 3 or 4 people who bring the car through tech can also pit the car. And, obviously, if you get a flat or something, you're going to be at much of a disadvantage than what you were before. But NASCAR's goal is to get these races run. The TV money is not paid to the tracks and to NASCAR and to the teams without races. And so I'll be very surprised if a race, the first couple of races at least, aren't quite different than what you saw, than what you've seen before, because they're just not going to be allowed to have 600 or 700 crew members at an event. typically NASCAR teams would probably bring about 15 per car times 40 cars. That's 600. If you can cut that down to 7 or 8, or even fewer, that cuts you down to about 350, 400 people, and that make a big difference, because probably when they get to the racetrack, they're going to have to be have their temperatures taken, and you're going to have a lot of there's going to be a lot of procedures there that that are going to be different. So yeah, I would expect potential one-day shows for sure. Just teams coming in and out, and I think that's why they're looking at the Southeast, because potentially they could drive, come in, do the race stuff, go home, and not even spend a night in a hotel.
Right. Also, when we look at we talked about potential tracks that possibly could be. Darlington was mentioned. Homestead was mentioned. The Homestead mayor and the officials that you've talked to are looking like they're going to be a go. And of course, Governor DeSantis basically said he does want NASCAR back on the track. Is Florida the best destination for possibly NASCAR, because that's what it's looking like and what it's sounding like?
I think it just depends uh, on what your options are. If there's some closer options, I think NASCAR would prefer a little closer for at least the first few weeks. And again, if they go to Darlington, I wouldn't expect that to replace the Southern 500. Right. So what race does that replace? Is it Homestead? Is it another track that NASCAR owns? A lot of people wonder about Sonoma, right? Because it doesn't look like that you'd be able to run there at least in June. Right. So, but that track isn't owned by NASCAR; it's owned by Speedway Motorsports. So there's still a lot of things up in the air, but everything's fluid. But I would say that that if they can race in Florida, I would imagine that they'd race at Florida, and they'd race in Homestead if they can, and if it fits into any type of schedule that they can have.
And last question, when NASCAR does get back, is there a chance we could possibly see Ryan Newman back at the track? Because everyone's, since this whole thing, everyone's kind of forgot about what he's been up to.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say this: when Ross Chastain took over that ride, and remember, he already has a ride for the 600. I think the feeling is that he wouldn't be needed all the way through till the 600. And so, going from the timeline set earlier, while they didn't give us any too much specifics, I kind of felt like the feeling is that Ryan would be back at least by some point in May. And so, I would say that we haven't heard anything new. But I would expect that Ryan Newman would be back, or would only miss a race or two. I think that he should be able to come back soon.
All right. Actually, I just thought of one more. The financial impact with these teams. If the shutdown continues, let's say they don't get to the mid-May date, or they go farther on. I know there are some teams that have laid off employees or something like that. How long can these smaller teams or any teams last throughout?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the teams have had some sort of either pay cuts or layoffs, or I think virtually every team probably has had something. But the longer this goes on, the tougher it gets. So I think it's. Again, I would say some of the smaller teams, if it went into late June, I would say, some of the single car teams are going to probably be in pretty rough shape, and some of the more underfunded teams will be in rough shape. And it's just, just gonna have to see what type of help they can get, whether that's through the CARES Act, or through some sort of loan or something like that to get them through. So yeah, it's been tough on the teams, and I think that's why there's the push to start in mid-May, if at all possible.
All right, Bob, I know we've covered a ton of topics, and I'm sure we're going to be probably covering more as this goes on. So don't be surprised if I ask you back on and we can re-update a lot of this stuff. But anyway, thank you so much, Bob, getting us up to speed on what NASCAR has been up to during the coronavirus pandemic.
All right. Thanks, Casey. Thanks for having me on.